Okay, so here we are on Monday. We should be able to finish our Earth history PowerPoint today. Last class period, we started at the very bottom, this Hadean era, and just looking at it quickly, I don't have my pointer in front of me, but we can see the origin of the Earth is at 4.6 billion years ago. We said there was two different lines of evidence that pointed to that date. Neither one originated here on Earth. We said the Hadean era came to an end at about 4 billion years ago when the first rocks had cooled and solidified. That Hadean era was followed by the Archean time period where we saw the first prokaryotic cells. Somewhere in the middle of that Archean period, the prokaryotic cells, some of them figured out photosynthesis, and we saw rising levels of oxygen in the atmosphere all the way through the back end of that Archean period until oxygen levels had accumulated enough that the first eukaryotic cells could show up. And that's where we drew the line here at 2.5 billion years ago. So now we've got the first eukaryotic cells. Those eukaryotic cells really start to diversify, and we'll see some of the protists as we get into the next couple of weeks. But some of those single-celled eukaryotic organisms started to work together, and we had some of the first multicellular organisms by the end of this Proterozoic time period. I can't remember if I'd shown pictures of these Ediacaran fauna, but I found a couple and I wanted to share them here. You can see these are rocks that date back to 635 million years ago. So before that Cambrian explosion, there were still fossils, there were still animals around. They just didn't have hard parts, so they left fewer marks in the rocks. But these are good examples of multicellular organisms that come from this Ediacaran time period. Shortly after this, we said, is when there was an explosion of fossils in the fossil record because we cross our first bold line that takes us into our Paleozoic era. So this is where we spent most of our time. Last time, we had mentioned that this line in the sand that we draw was due to gaining hard parts, but the other two bold lines that we're going to see are going to be due to devastating mass extinctions due to meteor impacts. Let's quickly review the Paleozoic era. This time, and we don't really know, we don't need to know where the continents are. What I would point out on these slides are the key notes about what's going on during this time period. So we said the Cambrian explosion was an explosion of organisms that have hard parts. If you get a chance, over here on the left-hand side, the first fossil that we have is a fossil of one of these trilobites. So you can kind of get an idea of what some of these things looked like. You can see the segmentation. You can see the hard exoskeleton, which was prominent on a lot of organisms of this time period. We saw some slides that showed a variety of these. We didn't have to know specific examples. There was one that we pointed out that did not have an exoskeleton that is around during this Cambrian time period that will end up evolving into some of the first primitive fish. In fact, at the end of this Cambrian time period, I'm going to set my exoskeleton trilobite down. And I will point out by the end of the Cambrian, we had some of the first fish in the oceans. And these are similar to common, like present-day hagfish. I will bring videos of hagfish. You can also Google these things. They're, like I mentioned last time, they are jawless fish. They have a sucker-like mouth that allows them to attach onto stuff, but they can't clamp down or bite onto anything. Okay, so out of the Cambrian and into this Ordovician time period, the Ordovician time period, somewhere around 475 million years ago, we've got a couple of notable things that are happening here. And again, we mentioned this last time, so I won't take as much time as I did last time. You see, during the Ordovician time period, the invasion of plants and fungus that make their way onto land. This is what the Ordovician time period looked like. We had in the oceans those trilobites that are cruising around, and these shelled mollusk-like organisms that are kin to squids and octopus, except they have this long protective shell that's kind of tube-shaped. I brought in a couple of fossils. The one that I have over there kind of looks like this, except it's a little bit smoother rock, the one that I have. You can see these segmentations of these shells. Sometimes they had a little coil to the end of them. I'll say this, there's another fossil that I have that's right next to this one. It's a little bit smaller, so it's not as eye-catching of a fossil, but this small one, if you look at it, you can see a little hollow tube in the middle of this organism. And what that is, this is going to evolve into a chamber that can be filled with gas, And the gas that fills this chamber comes from the bloodstream of this organism. So you have an ability to extract gases from your bloodstream. This is what the respiratory system is doing. And we'll see that fish have this organ called a swim bladder, and they extract gases from their bloodstream and can fill that swim bladder up. Or they can reduce the gases from that swim bladder, and the gases go right back into their bloodstream. That ends up, what that does by adjusting how much gas is in that tube, it adjusts at what level in the water column these organisms float. So it's like a submarine that can adjust at what level of the water column it floats by adjusting how much gas it has in this tube. So when we go back to that other picture, you don't see these organisms with flippers that are just constantly flipping so that they can stay in the water and don't sink to the bottom. What allows them to kind of hover in place is they've got this hollow tube in the middle that they can adjust at what level that they float. Wild. Okay. Past that, quickly into the Silurian, we said a couple of notable things that happened during the Silurian time period. Remember, just before that, in the Ordovician, plants got a toe onto land. They're going to expand their range onto land during the Silurian time period. In fact, let's just look at that picture right here. You can see during the Silurian time period, plants, as they move deeper into the land, what really allows them to do that, you can see they're taller than they were in the Ordovician time period. Ordovician time period, plants had no vascular tissue, so they grew like carpet, just moss on the surface of the ground. In the Silurian time period, we're going to see plants evolve vascular tissue for the first time. And one of those plant fossils I have over here, if you grab it and look at it kind of from the transverse cut, you can see these tiny little holes. And those are vascular tubes that this plant used to pull water up to the leaves. Vascular tissue allowed these plants to move into the interior of the land, one, and two, it allowed them to grow taller. It acted like a skeletal support system, and that allowed them to reach up and to grab more sunlight. So it was advantageous for a couple of reasons. So plants really start to expand into the interior during the Silurian time period. And then also in the oceans, there's another major selective pressure that shows up. Again, we mentioned this last time. Those jawed fishes about 425 million years ago start to show up on the fossil record. And it's really these jawed fishes that change the playing field. Now you have these dominant predators in the deep oceans, and it starts to push the other living organisms into the shallows that don't have that big a jaw. Hence the Devonian time period. We see the Devonian time period is when these organisms are pushed into the shallow waters where there's lots of vegetation that sometimes can get in the way. So you start to see these pads that were once just used for cruising through the water start to move to the sides of the body. And these are to help move debris out of the way when you're cruising through the shallow waters. And then eventually, by the end of this Devonian time period, you see organisms that have adapted to occasionally life on land and then having to go back into the water. We see some of the first amphibians. You see the limbs start to, instead of, they move out to the side and then underneath the organism to support some of the body weight. We'll see some other adaptations that these amphibians are going to take to further break their link with water. But first, tetrapods make their way onto land during the Devonian time period. This is an example of something that we'll see on Wednesday, so I won't get too in-depth into this, but what we're seeing here is one of these phylogenetic trees that attempts to show evolutionary relationships between organisms. And what it also does is it shows us something about geologic time scale, when these organisms show up in the fossil record. Not all phylogenetic trees do this. I think it's better when they do. Okay, so into the Devonian, we know we have tetrapods that have moved onto land. The end of the Devonian brings the beginning of the Carboniferous period. We separated this Carboniferous period into early Carboniferous and late Carboniferous. Early Carboniferous is when we had an explosion of the first forest. We had just mentioned before that plants had figured out vascular tissue. They had moved into the interior of the land, and they really start to explode into some of the first forests that had ever been grown on the surface of the earth. And we had mentioned that it was early in this Carboniferous time period when the first forests had grown so large, they basically filtered out a lot of the carbon dioxide that was in the atmosphere and they replaced it with oxygen. So there was a time period, this Carboniferous time period, when oxygen levels were extremely high. We said the insects and organisms that had exoskeletons, because they suck in oxygen through those little spiracles, those little holes in their segments, we said during this time period, insects, things with exoskeletons were really large because oxygen levels are really high. If oxygen levels are really high, that means carbon dioxide levels are starting to drop. You hear all the time now that carbon dioxide levels are rising and that's bad for us, but plants are loving it. And plants were happy about it early in the Carboniferous time period because there was lots of carbon dioxide that they could use and grow to really large forests. But by the end of this Carboniferous time period, we see that the plants have now kind of changed the composition of the atmosphere where they've sucked out a lot of the carbon dioxide and it's really high in oxygen, which isn't conducive to more plant growth. Plants don't like oxygen. They like the carbon dioxide. So we see the forest start to wane. And in addition to the forest waning at the end of the Carboniferous period, you see those tetrapods, the first vertebrate four-legged animals, really have speciated at the end of this Carboniferous period. Enter the Permian, where you've got a huge diversity of, you've got amphibians, you've got the first reptiles. You even have some of the first ancestors to mammals, which is what these organisms are with the sail on their back. These are just additional pictures that I added just to show how diverse life was at the Permian. This is somewhere around the time where we left off last time, where I was talking about how diverse life was. And then huge meteor impact took away 90% of living organisms. This one seems to be more of a direct meteor impact within the last decade as they were drilling offshore for oil in the southern tip of South America. They found a huge meteor impact, dates to 250 million years ago. And on the very opposite side of the globe from that meteor impact is where you have Siberia. And at the same time in geologic time period, 250 million years ago, in Siberia we see the crust just rips open and lava flows everywhere, even into the oceans, and kills off 90% of the living organisms. So our first bold line due to a devastating mass extinction. But a handful of individuals survive, and like we said, a handful of individuals are about to inherit a barren earth. And we're going to see these rapid bursts of speciation that follow these mass extinctions. So here we are. We've caught up now. We're ready for new information and new things. I tried to put some of the highlights in each of the time periods. I may mention more with my words, but hopefully you can see that. Here we are jumping into the Mesozoic era for the first time, and we'll start with key points from the Triassic time period. Here's what the Triassic landscape would have looked like. You see some of the first dinosaurs that show up. So let me go back to the slide I just skipped over. It's another one of these phylogenetic trees, and it has geologic time scale at the start. We don't have to know the differences between the different types of dinosaurs, but what it shows us is that the first dinosaurs show up during the Triassic time period. So if you can see over here, I put during the Triassic, we get the first dinosaurs. You also are going to see the first mammals. And another note during this Triassic time period, I'll go to this picture, you see some of the first ferns as well. You can see maybe a picture of one fern right over there. And I've got on the side of the room, I'll just go grab this. This is a fossil of one of these ferns. You can kind of see the imprint in the soil there. Just one of these vascular plants that start to show up during the Triassic period. I'm going to go back to this real quick just to plant one more thought. I may have mentioned this last time, I don't know, but I was recently watching one of those documentaries on the Nova PBS channel that talked about a trove of dinosaur fossils that have been found within the Arctic Circle in the last 5 or 10 years. Did anybody see that same documentary? It was wild because they were documenting that there were dinosaurs that lived in the Arctic in areas that were below freezing at certain points of the year. And that's crazy to think because reptiles that we know of are cold-blooded and they have to stay near the equator where it's warm. So this raises a bunch of questions. And the whole reason I'm bringing this up is because I don't want you to think like I was told by sweet old ladies or coaches that I had teaching me science growing up, that they said something to the effect of, Chad, we've got all the answers, we've got it figured out. Why don't you go be a banker or something like that? And I knew that was not true. There are so many questions in nature that are still out there. So I'm pointing this out because it's an available question that you might be able to go and study and get your name in the textbook. But what we know is that birds are warm-blooded. And the other reptiles that we have, like alligators and snakes or lizards, those that we have around today are cold-blooded. And we also know that birds have evolved from dinosaurs. So birds are warm-blooded. The reptilian ancestors that we have left are all cold-blooded. So there's somewhere along that lineage of bird evolution that warm-bloodedness showed up. And so it's not quite clear if, how many dinosaurs were warm-blooded. Like, where did warm-bloodedness start between birds and dinosaurs? And again, within the last 5 years or so, they have recently found fossils that show dinosaurs were living in frozen environments. And they did other things that birds do, like lay their eggs in a clutch, like they might have had to keep them warm. There's new stuff that we learn all the time. And I'm expecting within the next 10 years or so some of the textbooks to change to show, to maybe illuminate a little bit more about where this line of warm-bloodedness first shows up in the bird lineage. On a totally different branch of life, the mammals, we are warm-blooded too. So it's warm-bloodedness has shown up on two different branches. Again, stuff that we will also talk about when we start to show evolutionary relationships. I just wanted to show you that we don't know everything. We're still learning where warm-bloodedness shows up in the bird lineage. Anyway, first reptiles in the Triassic. We said the first ferns and the first mammals show up, but mammals are going to be kept in really low numbers during the entire Mesozoic time period. And we won't see them diversify, like we said, until the dinosaurs are gone. So let's put another note for the Mesozoic. If we jump to the Jurassic time period, the thing that we see in the Jurassic time period is a diversification of dinosaurs. Dinosaurs first show up in the Triassic, but they really start to spread and diversify and go through these adaptive radiations where there's tons of speciation between dinosaur forms, all during the Jurassic time period. It's also during this Jurassic time period that we see the first fossils of birds. We know that they're fossilized birds because they're the first feathers that show up. So birds came from reptiles. Reptiles lay eggs, so we can kind of put an end to that debate about whether the chicken or the egg came first. Right? Eggs were around in the fossil record for millions of years before feathers show up. And the first feathers show up, they weren't for flight at all. They were for things like insulation, protecting organisms from the cold, or for also displaying to members of the opposite sex. We saw a couple of videos last semester about how birds used their feathers to display to members of the opposite sex. So feathers were around a lot longer than birds have been around. And these kind of part reptile, part bird organisms that are found in the fossil record of about 145 million years ago are described as these transitional fossils between reptiles and birds, because reptiles, as we will learn, all reptiles have bony tails, and we can still see a bony tail here. All reptiles, they have claws on their forelimbs and their back limbs. You can still see that this organism has claws on its still has its fingers and claws. It, like a reptile, has a jaw with teeth in it, so you still see bony jaw and teeth. Birds, on the other hand, they have lost their bony tail. They've replaced it with feathers. They have hollow bones where this organism didn't have hollow bones. Birds no longer have a jaw with teeth. They've replaced it with a beak made out of keratin, so it's lighter. Birds have lost the claws on their forelimbs. So this is, but birds have feathers. So this thing has some bird characteristics. It has a lot of reptilian characteristics. By the end of this Jurassic time period, you see some of the first birds that have those bird adaptations that aren't part reptile, part bird. Okay. That takes us to the final period in the Mesozoic that we're going to call the Cretaceous. This has a couple of notable things that happen. Maybe the most notable is that the first angiosperms show up in the fossil record. Another term for angiosperms, these just mean flowering plants. So the first flowers with pretty smells and nectar and all these things that can attract pollinators, those show up first in this Cretaceous period. And I wish I had more on that. This is kind of a scene from the Cretaceous time period where we've got a diverse range of reptiles. The thing that I like here is that it shows a big flower and there's a bee that's on that flower. Not really shown here, but one of the things that we will see going forward in a lot of videos is that when plants evolve flowers, it starts this whole co-evolutionary relationships between certain species of plant and their flower and the animal that pollinates them. It's crazy to think that these plants start to trick the animals into pollination. They help these plants reproduce, and then with flowering plants, these are the ones that first started to produce fruits. Bless you. So fruits and flowers first show up during this Cretaceous time period, and that's basically a plant, a plant making an apple or something that's full of its own seeds. That's a plant giving a reward or paying an animal off. Here's a little nutrients for you. Here's some food to get you through the day. All you have to do is take my seeds and spread me into a new location. So plants really start to trick the animals, and we see all these co-evolutionary relationships that spark between flowering plants and animals, and there's a lot of speciation and diversifying that are going on. It would be a great time to be alive until that big mass extinction that comes in 66 million years ago and kills off a lot of that diversity. We saw a picture earlier in the semester that shows that KT boundary, which is the time period that dates to 66 million years ago. All the rocks below that are full of dinosaurs and a wide variety of types of dinosaurs and hardly no mammals at all. If you do find mammals, there's only a couple of types of mammals. But then after this boundary, we can see there's really we lose all the dinosaurs. The diversity of reptiles has dwindled, and the handful of mammals that survive really start to explode and diversify in newer rock, I guess, as we go higher up in the strata. So just to point where we are, we've come through the Mesozoic, and we are now at this bold line that shows the most recent mass extinction 66 million years ago, which we also know was due to a meteor impact. I thought I had a picture of that. I guess I didn't. Let me just jump around here for a second. This is at least one slide that shows that meteor impact 66 million years ago down here at the Yucatan Peninsula. It also shows the angle at which the meteor hit. It's not a direct impact like the one that happened 250 million years ago. It kind of came in at an angle, and some of the rocks that were kicked up were blown all the way to New York State. So we can kind of get an idea of the angle that thing came in. The result, like we said, was it killed off the dinosaurs and basically wiped the slate clean for the handful of mammals that survived to move out into the open. So we see the mammalian radiation as animals gain access to new territory that often leads to this rapid speciation. So that's exactly what we see here. Even though this is kind of a hard to read graph, we're thinking about the mammals. And if we see mammals in the fossil record, there's very few mammals that show up in the fossil record, but they date all the way back to the beginning of this Mesozoic time period. So during the Triassic, they likely were around because we can find their fossil record during early Jurassic time period. But there's very little diversity in mammals through the Jurassic, very little diversity in mammals all the way to the end of the Cretaceous. And then after the dinosaurs are killed off, we can see the mammals explode. In fact, these are groups of mammals. We are going to refer to these as orders of mammals. So primates, horses, whales, rodents. Proboscideans are things like elephants, manatees, and an organism called a hyrax, which is my favorite organism. We'll see those later on. These are different groups of mammals that have adapted to completely different conditions, and you don't see any of these varieties of mammals in the Mesozoic time period. They only diversify and show up in the Cenozoic. This is also a graph that kind of shows this spread of mammal diversity as we move into the Cenozoic. This box in the middle takes us all the way back to the Cretaceous period when there was just a handful of mammals. And as we move into the Cenozoic era, we can see a handful of mammals that survived that Cretaceous start to expand and speciate into these grazers that are covering great distances. Other ones have specialized into still meat eaters. But those handful of survivors, as they continue to move into new territories, start to continue to speciate and become different from one another, and are going to diversify into the major groups of mammals that we recognize today. So you don't see any of these types of mammals show up until towards the middle of that tertiary time period. So we know that we're in the Cenozoic. We can see mammals start to diversify, and I don't have a picture of it, but during the same time period, birds are doing the same thing. Birds show up in the Mesozoic, but they really don't start to diversify until the Cenozoic time period. And this is also something that isn't super important for this exam. What I like about this picture is that it ties into something that we mentioned last semester. We were talking about allopatric speciation. We said that organisms that are geographically isolated from one another are going to adapt differently to these different conditions. And if you think about continents in the southern hemisphere, there's Australia, there's Africa, there's South America. These are island continents where there's very little exchange between organisms. And on those separate ecosystems, you've got a completely different arrangement of mammals that have evolved that are unique to just those geographic regions. In the northern hemisphere, just due to geographic luck, it's shaped a little bit differently. The northern hemisphere is mostly land dominated, and because the Arctic can freeze over, you've got organisms that can move back and forth easily from the Europe continent over to North America. So these, like we said in talking about speciation last time, if there is gene flow between populations, those populations look the same. And just like there's been plenty of gene flow between Europe, Asia, and North America, these populations have stayed the same. But where we can disrupt gene flow, like you can see in the southern hemisphere where the continents are geographically isolated, we can get speciation, different organisms on different continents. That's what I like about this slide. And, I mentioned in plugging topics earlier in the semester, if you are interested in this type of stuff, there are classes that fall under the category of biogeography, in which you look at things like this and you think, all right, animals, if this geographic continent was all by itself, it is going to have unique organisms on it. And we know that these continents are not static, but they're moving around. So continents, as they bump into one another, are going to allow organisms to compete where they have never had to compete with one another before. We said South America has been drifting north, and only within the last 3 million years did that land bridge between North and South America pop up. So for the past 3 million years, there's been this faunal exchange between North and South America that is not balanced. North American mammals have taken over. Right now, over 60% of the mammals in South America have a North American origin. And currently, like we said, only 3 mammals in the northern hemisphere have a South American origin. Can anybody remember those from last semester? Take a guess. It's okay. It's a random question, maybe a chance for me to take a sip of coffee. But we're thinking about biogeography, the distribution of organisms. And I think I mentioned, maybe I didn't. If not, I'll mention it now. One of the mammals that lives in North America now that has a South American origin. There's only 3. Armadillo is one. A possum is the other one, and then a porcupine would be the third. And an armadillo and a porcupine, they've got really good defense mechanisms, so that's one reason they are able to persist in the northern hemisphere. And the possum, on the other hand, it's just so generalistic it can eat just about anything. So they have survived in the northern hemisphere. Anyway, what I want to show is mammal evolution. Mammal adaptation. As mammals moved into new territory, we start to see their bone structure change. And again, I'm planting the seed to some things that we're going to talk about on Wednesday. But when we start to show these evolutionary relationships, one of the things that we're going to use to describe evolutionary relationships are these terms primitive versus derived. Primitive refers to things that are older in the fossil record, and derived obviously means as organisms specialize, this is a derived form. I'd shown the picture earlier of, I'm just going to end this real quick and bring this thing back up. We saw this picture where this type of teeth structure could be described as the primitive type of teeth arrangement for the basal mammal. But mammals start to specialize in all kind of different feeding preferences. So you start to see these derived forms where anteaters and armadillos are highly derived, where having a variety of teeth would be the primitive form, the ancestral form. We can see as organisms specialize, they can end up with these highly derived forms that are nothing like their ancestral form. So now going back to these slides, this once again is just showing mammal evolution. The primitive stem mammal had 5 fingers and 5 toes, but we're going to see in this Cenozoic time period that mammals start to diversify, and we see these highly derived forms where not only do they specialize in having longer gaits, just meaning that without having to expend any more energy, if I want to get to the other side of the room, it might take me 20 steps to get over there. But if I could somehow, my bones could lengthen out and stretch out so that each step that I took, I would cover twice the distance. Well, now I can get over there with half the energy. I can take half the number of steps. And we start to see mammals that really are these grazing mammals that adapt to life on the plains, herd animals. They start to adapt these longer bone structures because they're trying to cover more ground. This is another example of what we saw last semester, and we called it homologous structures. Common ancestry adapting to different professions in the habitat. So we'll see mammals with 5 fingers and 5 toes. We'll see mammals that have 4 fingers and 4 toes, so like your cats are examples of that. Pigs are examples of things that have, 2, or like a deer or something like that has the split hooves up front, 2 tiny little nubs in the back. We'll see horses are examples of organisms that are walking around just on a single digit. So this would be a highly derived form, having just a single digit, when a primitive form would be 5 fingers and 5 toes. So ancestral versus derived are things we'll talk about next time. The fossil record is full of a bunch of transitional fossils as mammals have adapted to different habitats. You can see as their forelimbs have changed. Anyway, some other things to point out in the Cenozoic era is, like I've just pointed out, diversity of mammals. This is showing us whale transitional fossils, and it all happens during that Cenozoic time period. So the most primitive whale transitional fossil that has been found dates to 48 million years ago, well within the beginning of that Cenozoic time period. It was found in sediments in Pakistan, which is why this thing was named Pakicetus. It was similar to a hooved mammal that started to adapt to aquatic habitats. And you can see 25 million years ago, the limbs have started to move out to the sides, indicating that this thing is not supporting its weight with those limbs anymore, but probably uses them more as a paddle. And then in 10 million years ago, you start to see whales that have lost their hind limbs altogether. And even present day whales, still without their hind legs, retain this vestigial pelvic girdle, showing that they have still markers in their body from a time when they used to have hind limbs, and those hind limbs needed a pelvis to attach to. The other thing that we see in the fossil record in the Cenozoic time period are primates that show up for the first time. This is kind of a famous fossil because it's the oldest primate fossil that's been found. And how we know it's a primate is you can look at the digits and we can see that it's got grasping forelimbs. That's one of the key features that makes you a primate. We all have the ability to touch our thumb to the tips of all of our fingers. So grasping hands is one thing. It allows us to grab onto a coffee mug or a branch if we're trying to jump to another tree. The other thing that makes you a primate is that you've got binocular vision, that you've got 2 eyes, not like a cow or a rabbit where the eyes are on the side of our head, but our eyes are right up front, meaning that there is a large overlapping field of view that each of our eyes sees. And what that overlapping field of view gives us is excellent depth perception. So if we're jumping to a tree and trying to grab onto a branch or grab this coffee mug, that 3D vision, that overlapping field of view gives us excellent depth perception. If you've ever, not that any of us in here have lost vision in one eye, but I've had a buddy that, like I said, growing up in Cameron, there's not a lot to do other than ride these gravel back roads. And one of the times when he pulled off of a gravel road onto a paved road, his tire was making noise because there was a rock stuck in it. When he put his head out the window, the rock came out of the tire and into his eye and popped the fluid in his eye. And so he lost vision in his left eye. And for a while there, he had lost all of his depth perception because he lost that binocular vision. Anyway, primates. We will see primate evolution as we get into future lectures. This is another one of these phylogenetic trees that shows evolutionary relationships between primates. You can see that ancestral primate starts at about 58 million years ago, which comes from that first primate fossil that we just saw on the previous slide. And since then, we can see that primates have continued to diverge from one another. This is nice because it shows something about geologic time scale in here. And I had put something on the board last time showing, kind of revealing some of my original misconceptions about how evolution works. That, you know, looking at this chart showing phylogenetic relationships, it shows that chimpanzees and humans, how can I say that? I can say that chimpanzees are the closest living relative to humans. And so my brain, like I said originally when I was first getting into these classes, I thought, okay, well, if chimps are the next in line to humans, how long is it before a chimp evolves into a human? And that's not the right way to think about it. Instead, what we're saying is that chimps are the closest living relative to humans. So if we were to go back on the fossil record to about 7 million years ago, this is a time where there was not any chimps and there was not any humans. Instead, there was the common ancestor, a group of apes that we're going to call Sahelanthropus. And they're going to diverge, and some of those members are going to end up evolving into this lineage that we'll call chimpanzees, and another group ended up evolving into this branch that we're going to refer to as humans. And if we get into human evolution, we would see that branch that led to humans, that there's a whole variety of different human types. In fact, this is just a few examples. We mentioned 7 million years ago, there is this genus called Sahelanthropus. It is the common ancestor to us, but there have been a lot of different varieties of human-like species that were around before, you know, just present day. And some examples, Sahelanthropus is a group of primates that came out of the trees and started to walk around on two legs. They had not yet started to walk upright, so they had not adapted to life out of the trees very well. You still see kind of a hunched over body form in these great apes of 7 million years ago. But about 4 million years ago, in these great ape fossils, you start to see a change in the body structure where they start to stand upright. So the whole pelvic girdle starts to shift and change. And this is also what allowed organisms to start to travel greater distances. So this coincides when a time period when the climate shifted and the first grasslands show up. So this is also a reason why we changed the genus name to Ardipithecus. Ardipithecus is referring to these apes that can walk upright. Sahelanthropus, still hunched over. And then something different changes with 2 million years ago. We now have a new genus called Homo, and there's Homo erectus, Homo habilis, Homo sapiens. There's a bunch of different species of Homo ape, and what they all have in common is tool usage. So some of the first Homo species are going to be using stone tools. We'll see this change to bone tools, eventually iPhones and nuclear warheads, right? So that continues to change as we go forward. Right, it happens quick. I probably will have to edit that part out. But you get the point. So in the Cenozoic time period, what we really see is diversity of mammals. A wide variety of mammals really start to speciate during this tertiary time period. What we see in the quaternary time period, what is kind of unique about this line that is drawn in the sand, is this is for the first time in the fossil record where we see Homo species. Apes that use tools. So that's noteworthy enough to draw the line and make this the Quaternary era. maybe I can say tool use. Again, first stone tools, and then it just ramps up from there. So that takes us at least through a quick rundown of geologic timescale. I don't know that there is much to cover past that, but there is right now on D2L, quiz 1 is available, and I think it goes away Wednesday at midnight. So I will plug, once again, right now you can take it multiple times, see what the questions are, take it a second time to get the right answers. That will go away Wednesday at midnight when we get access to a new quiz. So we don't have to know the epochs, we have to know the time periods and some major life forms that distinguished each of those time periods. The last few slides here are just showing us this was the last glacial maximum where the glaciers were coming down into North America. This next slide just kind of shows the modern world where we are at. And all that I want you to notice as I click through these slides is the location of the deserts and the location of the highly vegetated areas. Look at how there's a big band of vegetation along the equator. And then if we go north or south of the equator to about 30 degrees latitude, there are deserts that show up at about 30 degrees latitude. Even down here at about 30 degrees latitude, those are where the deserts kind of show up. And you know, as we move this through, we can see the continents move around, but the location of the deserts pretty much stay at about 30 degrees latitude, north or south of that equator. This reminds us of those circulating air currents that we talked about. Anywhere that we're looking at the equator, there are the interactions between those two Hadley cells. So there's a low pressure that causes rising air currents to rise and cool off and drop their moisture. So we see bands of rainfall along the equator. We also said if you get up to about 60 degrees latitude, there's another band of rainfall due to the interaction between a polar cell and a feral cell. We don't have to know the names of the cells. We just need to know that there's rainfall at the equator. There's rainfall at about 60 degrees latitude, north or south of the equator. And in between there, at about 30 degrees latitude, is where you have those feral cells and Hadley cells that interact. That's where we have this built-in pressure. That's where we have this built-in high pressure zone that bakes out the land and sucks up all the moisture. So we can see those deserts always falling around that part, 30 degrees latitude. So this just takes us into the distant future where it looks like all the continents may group together again, at which you can expect there to be massive competition between organisms, and it's always interesting to see how these things play out. That's the last slide that we got. We don't have to know anything about the future distribution of continents. I just wanted to show that even though continents move around, some of the features, like deserts or rainforest, are kind of baked into the climate. So again, just a reminder of earth science stuff. We've gotten all the way through our geologic time scale, so you should be able to answer all the questions on the quiz, and now I'm free to try and squeeze in into our Wednesday's lecture, taxonomy and systematic stuff. We'll know by Wednesday whether or not we have the lab supplies. If those haven't arrived by Wednesday, like I said, we'll push our lab back to the following week. But that's it for questions. Let me try that again. That's it for me talking, but if you have questions, I'll be glad to sit around and answer those. Remember, I've got some fossils over there on the left-hand side of the room if you want to check those out.